In this video, we will discuss the UK fiancé visa requirements in 2023 to 2024. We will also discuss frequently asked questions that partners have about UK fiancé visa applications, as well as mistakes you should avoid. As an OISC-regulated UK immigration law firm specialising in UK partner visas, we are very well placed to discuss this. So before we discuss the UK fiancé visa requirements, it is very important to first clarify two things. Firstly, you may be surprised to hear that there are two different kinds of UK fiancé visa applications. The first type is where the applicant, who is the person applying for the visa, is outside the UK when the online application is submitted. This type of visa will be a multiple entry 6-month visa, which will allow the applicant to enter and leave the UK as many times as they wish during the 6 months. And this is the case even after the marriage has taken place, as long as the next spouse visa application has not been submitted. And importantly, it will permit the applicant and sponsor, the UK partner, to marry in the UK and extend their stay in the UK without having to leave the UK. The second type of UK fiancé visa is where the applicant has already been granted a UK fiancé visa, but has not managed to marry in the 6-month period. In such a case, according to the immigration rules, there must be a good reason why the marriage did not take place, and you're able to provide evidence why it will take place in the next 6 months. Now, you may be wondering, what about applicants who have not already been granted a UK fiancé visa, but want to make the application from inside the UK? This, unfortunately, is not possible. A UK fiancé visa in such a case will only be able to be made from outside the UK. Therefore, if the applicant is already inside the UK, they will be expected to return to their country of nationality or country of legal residence and submit the application there. This video will discuss the requirements relating to the first type of fiancé visa, since this is what 99% of fiancé visa applicants apply for. Secondly, the fiancé visa requirements are identical to UK proposed civil partnership visas in all but name. Therefore, if you intend on applying for a UK proposed civil partnership visa, when I say fiancé visa, I'm also referring to UK proposed civil partnership visas. And when I say marriage, that word can also be substituted for civil partnership. The UK fiancé visa intention to live together permanently in the UK requirement. A requirement of the UK fiancé visa is that both you and your partner must intend to live together permanently in the UK. It is this requirement that a UK fiancé visa application distinguishes itself from a UK marriage visitor visa application. The position in the immigration rules is that if you both intend to marry in the UK and make the UK your permanent home, you should apply for a UK fiancé visa. On the other hand, if you both intend to marry in the UK but intend to live together overseas, you should apply for a marriage visitor visa. This is reflected in that, unlike a UK fiancé visa, a marriage visitor visa does not allow the applicant, the person that is applying for the visa, to extend their stay from inside the UK. Partners are not generally expected to provide supporting documentation relating to the intention to live together requirement. Rather, it's ordinarily implied simply because of you submitting a UK fiancé visa application. This requirement is very rarely problematic for the fiancé visa application. It will only really be problematic if there is information in the fiancé visa application which brings into question your intention to live in the UK together, such as one partner mentioning in their letter of support that they intend to live together permanently in another country. For partners who intend to split their time between the UK and an overseas country, it should be noted that the intention to live together permanently in the UK requirement applies to each application that you will have to make on the fiancé visa route to indefinite leave to remain, which for most partners will be, firstly, a UK fiancé visa application where a 6-month visa will be granted, the first FLRM application where 30 months further leave to remain will be granted. The first FLRM application can be submitted any time during the 6-month visa if the applicant and sponsor have married. It is not problematic at all if this first FLRM application is submitted on the last day of the 6-month fiancé visa. This is because in such a case, the fiancé visa will be automatically extended until a decision has been made on the FLRM application. Therefore, the applicant does not need to leave the UK, and in fact should not leave the UK when the application is processing, as that will withdraw the application. A second FLRM application, where another 30 months permission to stay will be granted. This application should ordinarily be submitted within 28 days before the expiry date of the first FLRM visa. And then finally, the indefinite leave to remain application, which should also be submitted within 28 days before the expiry of the second FLRM visa. So the reason why this is worth pointing out now is because if, during the 5-year plus journey to indefinite leave to remain, the applicant and/or sponsor spend a significant amount of time outside the UK, This can raise into question the intention to live together permanently in the UK requirement when the time comes for the next application. So the immigration rules, as it relates to all of these applications up until and including the indefinite leave to remain application, does not specify the amount of time the applicant can spend outside the UK until the intention to live together in the UK requirement can be problematic. The reason for spending time outside of the UK is very relevant. Working overseas and one or both partners going on a study trip as part of a course are examples of good reasons which justify spending extended periods outside the UK without bringing into question the intention to live together requirement for each of these applications. The UK Fiance Visa English language requirement. There are numerous ways that you can satisfy the English language requirement. We will now discuss each of them in turn. The first way to satisfy the English language requirement is for the applicant to be a national of a majority English-speaking country. If an applicant holds any of these nationalities, the only thing that you'll have to do is to submit their passport which shows this. The second way to satisfy the English language requirement is to have an academic undergraduate, master's or PhD awarded by an educational institution in the UK. In such a case, all you will need to do is to submit the degree certificate, which shows 1. The applicant's name, 2. The date and title of the award, and 3. The name of the awarding institution. The third way is for the applicant to be aged 65 or over when the application is submitted, in which case simply submitting the applicant's passport will satisfy the UK Fiance Visa English language requirement. So we have discussed the 3 easiest ways to satisfy the English language requirement. The other ways, unfortunately, involve some effort on your behalf, as we'll now discuss. The fourth way relates to applicants awarded an English taught academic undergraduate, master's or PhD degree outside the UK. Unlike academic qualifications awarded from inside the UK, English taught academic qualifications awarded outside the UK will need to be accompanied by documentation from ECTIS, which was previously known as UK NARIC. The documentation that you'll have to get from ECTIS depends on the country in which the qualification was awarded. If the qualification was awarded in one of the countries listed here, you will only need to obtain ECTIS documentation confirming that the qualification meets or exceeds the recognised standards of a bachelor's, master's or PhD in the UK. You will not need to obtain documentation from ECTIS that the qualification was taught or researched in English at or above the required level, because it would be assumed that this was the case. If the qualification was not awarded in one of these countries, however, the documentation required from ECTIS will be slightly different. You will need to provide 1. Documentation from ECTIS which confirms that the qualification meets or exceeds the recognised standards of a bachelor's, master's or PhD in the UK. And 2. Documentation from ECTIS which confirms the degree was taught or researched in English at or above CEFR A1 level. You will note that the list of countries here is almost identical to the majority English-speaking countries list, except that Canada is not on the list here. Partners can also sit a secure English language test, otherwise known as a CELT, to satisfy the Fiance Visa English language requirement. Since you only need to satisfy the English language requirement via one of the numerous ways we've discussed, this is not required if the applicant is a majority English-speaking nationality, will be aged 65 or over when the online application is submitted, or already holds an undergraduate, master's or PhD degree awarded from inside the UK. However, applicants who have been awarded an English taught undergraduate, master's or PhD from an educational institution outside the UK may prefer to sit a secure English language test, as partners often find this less tedious than going through the ECTIS process. There are a few things to cover here. Firstly, a secure English language test and an English language test is not necessarily the same thing. The Home Office have specifically created secure English language tests because there was some controversy some years back when applicants took English language tests at dodgy English language test centres. So a secure English language test is an English language test that has been specifically approved by the Home Office and is one which is taken at a Home Office approved test centre. Here is the list of the secure English language tests. Most commonly, we tend to recommend to Fiance Visa applicants that they sit an IELTS life skills test. Not only can a lot of IELTS life skills test guides be found online and in local bookstores worldwide, but all IELTS life skills tests are taken at Home Office approved test centres. The reason why we do not generally recommend the IELTS for UK VI tests, which essentially comprises of the IELTS for UK academic and IELTS for UK VI general training tests, is because of 2 reasons. Firstly, the fiancé and subsequent partner visas only require you to pass an English language test in speaking and listening. However, the IELTS for UK VI tests also assess reading and writing, which is not required. Secondly, the IELTS IELTS for UK VI tests are offered at both Home Office approved test centres, as well as test centres which are not specifically approved by the Home Office for the purpose of your UK Fiance visa application. For example, here is an IELTS General Training Test certificate for a test taken at a Home Office approved test centre. This is fine to rely on since it contains a UK VI number. And here is an IELTS academic test certificate for a test which was not taken at a Home Office approved test centre. Unlike the certificate on the left, this does not contain a UK VI number and therefore cannot be relied on in the Fiance visa application. Another thing worth considering at this stage is the minimum level of secure English language test required. So the standard route to indefinite leave to remain is a UK Fiance visa application, where a 6-month visa will be granted. A minimum level of A1 test is required here, and then the first FLRM application, which is basically just a spouse visa application from inside the UK. 13 months permission to stay in the UK will normally be granted here. If you sit a test which is A1 level or above, you will be able to reuse the same test relied on for the Fiance visa application. You will not need to take another test. The next application will be the second FLRM application, aka a spouse visa extension, where another 30 months permission to stay will be granted. To satisfy the English language requirement here via the secure English language test route, the applicant will need to submit a test which is A2 level or above. So secure English language tests are valid for 2 years. However, if you successfully relied on a secure English language test in the previous application and submit the correct application before the visa expires, partners can ordinarily rely on the same English language test result. So if the applicant sits an A2 level secure English language test for their Fiance visa application, they will normally be able to reuse the same test to satisfy the English language requirement for the second FLRM application. The next application will ordinarily be the indefinite leave to remain application, using the SET-M application form. To satisfy the English language requirement here via the secure English language test route, the applicant will need to submit a CELT which is B1 level or above. Again, it is ordinarily the case that a secure English language test certificate can be reused. So if the applicant sits a B1 secure English language test for their Fiance visa application, they will ordinarily be able to rely on that same test certificate for the indefinite leave to remain application, as well as the British citizenship application, otherwise referred to as the British naturalisation application, which only some applicants choose to apply for. There are 2 final points worth discussing concerning secure English language tests. A good resource to find out if an applicant's English language ability in speaking and listening is good enough to pass the A1, A2 or B1 English language test is YouTube. And then finally, if you book a secure English language test, please make sure that you book it on the official website. There is a surprising amount of dodgy third-party websites that try to make you believe that they are the official website, but instead charge you an additional fee for them to book the English language test for you. There are also 2 English language requirement exemptions for Fiance visas. In other words, where one of the following applies, the applicant will not be required to satisfy the Fiance visa English language requirement. The first exemption is the disability exemption. The disability exemption will apply if the Home Office caseworker considers the applicant to have a disability, a physical or mental condition, which prevents them from either learning English or taking an approved secure English language test at the required level. There are no blanket exemptions. With this being said, if the applicant is deaf, is a person without speech, or has a speech impediment which limits their ability to communicate in English, the exemption will likely be granted. The second exemption is the exceptional circumstances exemption. This applies only if the Home Office caseworker agrees that there's exceptional circumstances that prevents the applicant from meeting the requirement. Most commonly, this exemption is inquired about when there are no Home Office approved English language test centres in the applicant's country of residence. The Home Office guidance states that it generally expects applicants in such a situation to travel to another country to take the test. This exemption will only apply if applicants can show, by submitting supporting evidence and providing a detailed explanation, that it is not practical or reasonable for them to travel to another country to take the test. Partners, however, will ordinarily have to show more than inconvenience or reluctance to travel overseas, such as where the visa requirements make it very difficult for the applicant to travel overseas. The UK Fiance visa relationship requirements. In addition to intending to marry in the UK and intending to live together with the sponsor in the UK permanently, which we discussed earlier, there are numerous other relationship requirements that must be met. The first first requirement is that the sponsor of the application, otherwise referred to as the UK partner, must be 1. A British citizen, or 2. Settled and present in the UK. Regarding the word settled, the sponsor will be settled if they have indefinite leave to remain or permanent residency. And regarding the word present, this is a bit misleading, as even if the sponsor is not physically present in the UK when the application is submitted, this is not problematic as they will be deemed to be present in the UK if they express in the application that they will return to the UK with the applicant if the application is successful. Or 3. A person with pre-settled or settled status under the EU settlement scheme. Or 4. A person in the UK with humanitarian protection or refugee leave. Or 5. A person in the UK with leave as a worker or business person under Appendix ECAA extension of stay. Requirements 2, 3 and 4 that you and your partner must have met in person, must be aged 18 or over when the application is submitted, and you must not be within the prohibited degrees of relationships. Not being within the prohibited degree of relationships basically means that you and your partner cannot be immediate family members. Here is a summary of the prohibited degrees of relationships if this is something that concerns you. You will note that if you and your partner are cousins, this is not something that is problematic in the immigration rules. The next requirement that we will discuss is that you and your partner's relationship must be genuine and subsisting. So yes, the fiancé visa application will require you to persuade the Home Office caseworker that you are in a genuine relationship, as daft as that may sound. There are a few points that I'd like to make here. Firstly, the Home Office caseworker does not need to be 100% sure that your relationship is genuine. Rather, they must think that it's more likely than not that your relationship is genuine. In other words, the Home Office caseworker must think that there is a greater than 50% chance of your relationship being genuine. Secondly, the Home Office caseworker will consider the application as a whole when considering the genuine and subsisting relationship requirement. They will consider, among other things, whether you have children, whether you've cohabited, whether you share financial responsibilities, how long you've known each other for, and whether you've visited each other's home country and family. The list of relevant factors is quite long here, and can be something that we discuss in more detail in a video dedicated to the genuine relationship requirement. If you'd like to see such a video, feel free to let us know in the comments by liking the video and subscribing to the channel. Thirdly, the genuine relationship requirement is decided more in light of the relevant factors of a genuine and subsisting relationship than the documents that you submit. In fact, many of the relationship documents that partners submit are completely disregarded. This is a point worth making because we're fully aware that many partners want to submit as much documentation as they can get their hands on, such as tons of photographs, chat logs, statements from third parties, evidence of money transfers, gift receipts, and flight and booking confirmations. I remember when I was working my first job as an immigration advisor in 2015 with another company, we always put together huge bundles of relationship supporting documents for partner visa applications. What my previous employer and I were doing there, just as many partners do today, was providing the Home Office with a ton of documentation which was, and will be today, completely disregarded by the Home Office caseworker. We were guessing what the Home Office caseworker would give weight to when in reality, such an extent of the different types of relationship documents that we provided was completely unnecessary. The unwritten expectations of relationship documents is only something I know now, after first meeting my colleague, Ed Lowe, who worked in the Home Office for 25 plus years, as well as my other colleagues who I work with at migrate.org.uk, who have also worked in the Home Office for many years. Common examples of documentation which are given no or very little weight include flight tickets, statements from family and friends, wedding invites and receipts, social media posts, and money transfers and hotel bookings. And finally, you'll be glad to hear that the genuine and subsisting relationship requirement is something which rarely causes refusals. Normally, the genuine and subsisting relationship requirement only tends to cause issues where the applicant and or sponsor have a questionable immigration or relationship history, or have only met in person once or twice very briefly. The last fiancé visa relationship requirement that we will discuss is that any previous relationships of the applicant and or sponsor must have broken down permanently, unless it's a relationship which falls within one of the very few and very rarely relied on exceptions. There are 2 points worth making here. Firstly, the Home Office is primarily concerned that previous legally recognised relationships have broken down permanently. In other words, previous marriages or previous civil partnerships. Secondly, the breakdown of previous marriages or civil partnerships must be evidenced appropriately. For previous marriages of the applicant and or sponsor, you must provide a decree absolute or final order or overseas equivalent. A decree nisi or a conditional order or overseas equivalent will not suffice as these documents are not considered final. Other documentation which is typically fine to submit, depending on the circumstances, include a death certificate, annulment, or overseas equivalents. The UK Fiance Visa Tuberculosis requirement is discussed earlier on in this video. There are two types of Fiance Visa applications. One, Fiance Visa applications made from outside the UK, and two, Fiance Visa applications made from inside the UK. Certain applicants making an application from outside the UK will have to submit a TB test certificate showing that they are free from TB, whilst the TB requirement will never apply for Fiance Visa applications made from inside the UK. I use the words certain applicants, so let's discuss that. The starting position is that the applicant will need to take a TB test if they're living in one of the listed countries on the gov.uk website, or have been living in one of these countries 6 months before submitting the application. This list can be found by Googling countries where you need a TB test for your UK visa application. Here is the list at the time of shooting this video. Whilst this list does not change too frequently, please note that it's subject to change, so you should check before submitting the Fiance Visa application. However, as is very common throughout the immigration rules and Home Office guidance, there are exceptions. A TB test will not be required if the applicant is a diplomat accredited to the UK. The second exception is that the applicant has lived for at least 6 months in a country where TB screening is not required by the UK, and they've been away from that country for no more than 6 months. This wording, which is used in the Home Office guidance, is not the most clearly phrased sentence ever created, but there are two important implications of this. Firstly, if an applicant visits a country which requires a TB test in the 6 months before submitting the application, this does not automatically require them to take a TB test. Secondly, if an applicant relocates to a country which requires a TB test just before submitting the application, they will not ordinarily be required to take a TB test. For example, Jeff, an Australian national, previously lived in Australia for his whole life, a country which is not on the TB test list. Jeff moved to India, which is on the list, 2 months before submitting the Fiance Visa application from India, something he can do because he has an Indian work visa. Jeff is not required to take a TB test because the exception applies. He has lived for at least 6 months in a country where TB screening is not required by the UK, which is Australia, and he's not been away from Australia for longer than 6 months. There are numerous points relating to TB tests generally that are worth discussing here. The first is that the tuberculosis requirement also applies for dependent children who are also applying. Whilst children under 11 will not normally have a chest x-ray, where the TB test does apply, you must still obtain and submit documentation that shows that they do not have TB. If the child is British or if they have settled status in the UK, they will not be applying and therefore will not need to obtain any TB documentation. The second is that sponsors will never need to obtain TB documentation, even if they've been living in a country which ordinarily does require TB tests. The third is that the TB test must be taken at a Home Office approved clinic. You simply cannot book a TB test at any clinic which offers a TB test. The list of Home Office approved clinics can be found on the same gov.uk page we discussed earlier. Here you can see that all you'll need to do is click on the relevant country, click on the documents here, and then you will see more information about booking the TB test, and you'll also see the list of Home Office approved clinics. If you obtain a TB test at a Home Office approved clinic, you'll be issued with a TB test certificate which looks something like this. The TB test certificate does not always follow this format exactly. For example, in some clinics, the TB test certificate will not be completed electronically, as in this image, but rather it will be completed by hand. And on this TB test certificate, you will note that it references UK visas and immigration and states no evidence of active pulmonary TB. Some certificates will reference the Home Office instead of UK visas and immigration. These are the important bits. On this certificate, as is standard, it states you must carry this certificate with you in your hand luggage when you travel to the UK and present it to the immigration officer on arrival. Failure to do so will result in a delay to your journey and you may be required to undergo the tests again. Whilst we would recommend bringing a copy of the TB test certificate, it is rather unlikely for the immigration officer on arrival to want to see this document. TB test certificates are valid for 6 months. A question that you may have now is, what if, by the time the applicant arrives at the UK airport, the TB test certificate has passed its 6-month validity date? This is not something to worry about at all, because the only date that the TB test must be valid is the date that you submit the application. And finally, it may be worth noting that in your Fiance Visa route to indefinite leave to remain or British citizenship, this should be the only time that you'll have to concern yourself about the TB test. It will not be a requirement for a future application. The Fiance visa financial requirement. If you're preparing and submitting the application yourselves, this is certainly something that you want to focus on, as the financial requirement is the most common cause for visa refusals. In this video, we will focus on two important aspects of the financial requirement. One, the level of income that you will need to satisfy the financial requirement, and two, how you can calculate you or your partner's income in accordance with the immigration rules. The calculation of the income is something that is particularly important because the way in which your income is calculated is not something that is always necessarily intuitive. So, how much income will you need to satisfy the Fiance visa financial requirement? You must first ask yourselves whether the sponsor, the UK partner, receives any of these, whether that is on behalf of their child or not. If the sponsor does receive one of these, you'll be glad to hear that you must show much less income than is ordinarily required. This is because the adequate maintenance test applies. For more information about the adequate maintenance test, I would recommend reading our adequate maintenance test guidance on our website, migrate.org.uk, where we break this down step by step. Since it's only a minority of applications where the sponsor receives one of these, however, when discussing the financial requirement in this video, we will assume that the sponsor does not receive any of these permitted benefits. If the sponsor does not receive one of these, the starting point is that you must show that your gross annual income, the income before tax, is greater or equal to £18,600 when you submit the online application. This is known as the minimum income threshold. I use the word starting point because the minimum income threshold can vary if 1. Dependent children are also applying, and 2. Cash savings are being included in the financial requirement. Let's first discuss dependent children and their impact on the minimum income threshold of £18,600. If there is a dependent child or dependent children who are also applying, the minimum income threshold of £18,600 will be increased. I tried to stress the word applying because dependent children who are British citizens, have settled status, or are not applying will not affect the minimum income threshold of £18,600. This table shows the minimum income threshold based on the number of dependent children applying. If you apply with 2 dependent children, the minimum income threshold changes from £18,600 to £24,800. It is also worth noting here that if you apply with dependent children, you must also satisfy separate requirements in relation to their application. We discussed these additional requirements in a separate YouTube video. When determining the amount of income you need to satisfy the financial requirement, you may also consider the question, are cash savings being included in the application? Cash savings can 1. Meet the minimum income threshold alone, 2. Be combined with other sources of income to meet the minimum income threshold, or 3. Be completely disregarded if another permitted source of income satisfies the minimum income threshold alone. We will provide a step-by-step account of how you can calculate cash savings later on in this video, but it may be worth noting here that £18,600 in cash savings will not meet the minimum income threshold alone. Rather, this table here shows the required amount of cash savings based on whether dependent children are applying or not. Here you can see that £62,500 is required to satisfy the minimum income threshold alone when no dependent children are applying, and higher if dependent children are applying. The reason why these figures are much higher than simply having to have £18,600 in cash savings is because, as we will discuss, since cash savings is not inherently an income, the Home Office caseworker will follow a formula to calculate a gross annual income equivalent figure. So that was a discussion on how much income you will need to satisfy the financial requirement. Let's now discuss the various sources of permitted income that you can include, as well as how to calculate that income. Sponsors' employment income. The first step is to identify whether the employer is a specified limited company or not. This is important to know because if the company is a specified limited company, the requirements, calculation and required documentation will change. The first thing to note is that a specified limited company is not necessarily the same as a limited company. Whilst the specified limited company will always be a limited company will rarely be a specified limited company. Okay, so let's break this down. A specified limited company is defined in the immigration rules as 1. A limited company that is registered in the UK, and 2. The person whose income you are relying on is an employee and/or director of that company, and 3. The applicant, sponsor, or family members of the applicant or sponsor hold shares in the employing company, and 4. Any remaining shares, not including the applicant, sponsor, or family members of the applicant or sponsor, must be held either directly or indirectly by fewer than 5 other persons. I try to stress each of these ands, and this is because all of these need to be met for the company to be a specified limited company. For example, if the company is not registered in the UK, it is technically not a specified limited company. If the applicant, sponsor, or family members of the applicant or sponsor do not hold shares of the employing company, that company is not a specified limited company. If shares are held but there are not fewer than 5 other persons who hold the remaining shares, it will not be a specified limited company. If you're still not sure whether the employing company is a specified limited company or not, we break this down in greater detail in part 2 of our 3-part Common Mistakes video series, which can be found on our YouTube channel. We will now discuss non-specified limited company employment income in the UK. Only the sponsor's employment income and not the applicant's can be included in the Fiance visa application. And this is because of the immigration rules, which states that the applicant's employment income can only be included if they're aged 18 years or over, they are working legally, and are in the UK. Therefore, as shown in this table, in your immigration journey towards the applicant obtaining indefinite leave to remain, otherwise known as permanent residency, the earliest stage at which the applicant can include their employment income towards the financial requirement is in the second FLRM spouse visa extension application, and this is because it will only be until the first FLRM application is granted that the applicant can work in the UK legally. Non-specified limited company employment income can either be included under Category A or under Category B. Category A and Category B have different requirements, require different documentation, and calculate income differently, so you must know which category you will be relying on. This is the case even though the online application form does not reference either Category A or Category B. If the sponsor will have been employed for 6 months or longer by the current employer, they can apply under Category A or B. Category A is the more straightforward approach. So, if the sponsor will have been employed for 6 months or more when the online application is submitted, first consider Category A. If the Category A calculation is met, feel free to ignore Category B completely. If, however, the sponsor will not have been employed for 6 months or longer when the online application is submitted, that income can only be included under Category B. We will first discuss Category A, which is the category for including non-specified employment income in the financial requirement. If you're considering including your employment income under Category A, the first thing that you must identify is whether the sponsor is in salaried or non-salaried employment. This is because salaried and non-salaried employment are calculated completely differently. The salaried-non-salaried distinction is not always clear-cut, but I'll do my best to try and explain here. Salaried employment typically involves being paid a fixed basic amount per year, such as £25,000 per year. It is also commonly the case that salaried persons in their contractual agreement can earn bonuses, overtime or commission. Non-salaried employment, on the other hand, typically involves being paid by the hour or day, for example £15 an hour or £300 a day. Like salaried employment, non-salaried employees may receive commission, bonuses and overtime. Pay slips are often very helpful when determining whether the Home Office caseworker is likely going to determine the employment to be salaried or non-salaried. This is an image of a salaried monthly pay slip. Here we can see the basic monthly pay of £3,213.46 and a bonus of £1,466. The basic pay for salaried employees tends to stay the same month after month. This figure only changes when the employer gives the employee a pay rise or pay cut. The bonus figure here, just like overtime, tends to vary month after month. Here is an example of a monthly non-salaried pay slip. This pay slip clearly states hourly pay, and if you see the other pay slips that cover the relevant financial period, it will be clear that the monthly hourly pay received varies considerably. Before we discuss the calculation of both salaried and non-salaried employment under Category A, it is important to note that the requirements and calculations slightly differ if the employed sponsor is based overseas when the online application is submitted. Importantly, sponsors who are based overseas when the application is submitted will also need to provide a job offer in the UK. That job offer must also satisfy the financial requirement, either alone or combined with another source of permitted income, if that employment income is to be included towards the financial requirement. The following will relate to where the employed sponsor is based inside the UK when the the online application is submitted. I'll now discuss two different methods that you can use to calculate the gross annual income for salaried employment under Category A. The first method is the quicker and easier way. The second method can be ignored by 99% of partners. If the first method equals or exceeds the financial requirement, feel free to ignore the second method completely. Method 1. Multiply the lowest total monthly pay as seen in the payslips covering the 6 months prior to submitting the application, including basic pay, commission-based pay, overtime, bonuses, payments to cover travel time, and skills and UK location-based allowances, by 12 if monthly payslips are received, or by 52 if weekly payslips are received. For example, we gathered the last 6 months payslips, and it is this payslip here which shows the lowest total gross pay of £4,679.46. Since it's a monthly payslip, we multiply this figure by 12, which results in a gross annual income of £56,153.52. Therefore, as long as the application is evidenced correctly, £56,153.52 is the figure which can be used to satisfy the financial requirement. So you may be surprised to see that we ignored the net pay figure and that we ignored any of the deductions here. This is because, as is normally the case, the employer pays the employment income directly to the sponsor's bank account and does not pay the sponsor cash in hand. The Home Office is only concerned about the gross figure here. Being paid cash in hand is one of the many smaller considerations that we have to consider, and we can discuss this, along with more of the other minutiae of the immigration rules, in a separate video. So, if you want us to create more of these kinds of videos, like the video, subscribe, and all of the other stuff YouTubers say. The second method involves the following. Step 1. Multiply the lowest basic gross pay as seen in the payslips, which cover the 6 months prior to submitting the online application, by 12 if monthly payslips are received, or by 52 if weekly payslips are received. This figure will then be the gross annual basic salary that can be included towards the financial requirement. Step 2. Total the overtime, bonuses, commission-based pay, payments to cover travel time, and skills and UK location-based allowances, as shown in the payslips that cover the 6 months before submitting the application. Step 3. Divide the figure that you reached in Step 2 by 6, and then multiply this by 12. And then Step 4. Add the figure you reached in Step 3 with the figure reached in Step 1. The result of following Step 4 will be the total amount of salaried employment income that can be included towards the financial requirement. Let's now discuss how to calculate non-salaried employment income where the sponsor is based inside the UK when the online application is submitted under Category A. Step 1. After gathering the payslips which cover the 6 months period before the submission of the application, total the gross amount received. Here, you can include the standard basic pay, for example, the £15 per hour, overtime, commission-based pay, bonuses, payments to cover travel time, and skills and UK location-based allowances. So, for example, here you can see a table which shows the 6 monthly payslips which cover the 6 months prior to submitting the application. The total gross monthly pay, as seen on the 6-month payslips, totals to £17,000. Step 2. Divide this figure by 6, regardless of whether the payslips are issued monthly, weekly, or daily. Continuing from this fictitious example here, £17,000 divided by 6 is £2,833.33. And then finally, step 3, multiply this figure by 12. £2,833.33 multiplied by 12 is £33,999.96. This is therefore the amount of non-salaried employment income that can be included towards the financial requirement under Category A. Let's now discuss Category B, which is the category that is used for some sources of non-specified employment income. So when will you need to know about Category B? Category B is for sponsors who have 1. Been employed for fewer than 6 months when the application is submitted, or 2. Been employed for 6 months or longer when the application is submitted, but do not satisfy the financial requirement under Category A. So if the sponsor satisfies the financial requirement under Category A, just ignore Category B, as I'm sure that you have much better things to do than spend time learning about requirements that don't apply to you. Another thing worth noting is that sponsors based overseas when the application is submitted can also include their employment income under Category B. But again, the requirements vary slightly. Since only a small percentage of sponsors are based overseas when the application is submitted, this video will discuss the calculation and requirements as it applies to sponsors based in the UK when the online application is submitted. Sponsors who wish to rely on Category B must satisfy 2 different tests. Both tests must be satisfied to include employment income under Category B. The first test is that the gross annual income that is being received when the application is submitted must equal or exceed the financial requirement that applies, which is £18,600 for most applications applications, but this will be higher if there are dependent children applying. In the first test, you can only include employment income from current employers. You cannot include employment income from previous employers. The gross annual income calculation varies depending on whether the employment is salaried or non-salaried. If the employment is salaried, multiply the most recent payslip that will be submitted prior to submitting the application by 12 if monthly payslips are issued, or by 52 if weekly payslips are issued. The calculation involves a few more steps if employment is non-salaried. First, you must total the employment income the sponsor received since employment started up to a maximum period of 12 months. Second, you must then divide this number by the number of months if monthly payslips are issued, weeks if weekly payslips are issued, or by the number of days if daily payslips are issued since employment started up to a maximum period of 12 months. For example, if the sponsor receives monthly payslips and has been employed by their employer for 4 months when the application is submitted, divide this number by 4. And then finally, step 3 requires you to multiply this figure by 12 if monthly payslips are issued, 52 if weekly payslips are issued, or 365 if daily payslips are issued. The figure that you reach at step 3 here will be the amount of non-salaried employment that can be included towards part 1 of the 2-part test. As we discussed in our in-depth financial requirements article on our website, migrate.org.uk, you can combine cash savings as well as other sources of income with part 1 here. The second test requires the sponsor to have received the level of employment income required in the 12 months prior to submitting the application. So gather the payslips which cover up to the 12 months prior to submitting the application, and then total the gross amount received. Just like part 1 of the test, you can include basic salary or pay, bonuses, overtime, commission-based pay, payments to cover travel time, and skills in UK location-based allowances. And unlike part 1 of the test, where only current employment income is relevant, you can include employment income from previous employers. Okay, so there are a few other things to note about part 2 of the 2-part test. Firstly, whether the sponsor is in salaried or non-salaried employment is irrelevant here. Secondly, the sponsor does not need to have been employed for each of the 12 months prior to submitting the application. In other words, there is nothing necessarily wrong with there being gaps in employment in the 12 months prior to submitting the application. And finally, with regards to category B, there is no minimum length of employment that is required. So technically, a sponsor can meet the financial requirement by only relying on 1 week if they receive weekly payslips, or 1 month if they receive monthly payslips, if they're a particularly high earner. For example, Mary has been employed for only 1 month in the previous 12 months. She receives £240,000 a year as a surgeon, and her first monthly payslip totals to £20,000. This payslip satisfies part 1 of the 2-part test because this payslip shows that she has a gross annual salary of £240,000 when the application is submitted, and this payslip also satisfies part 2 of the 2-part test because this payslip shows that her £20,000 is higher than the minimum income threshold of £18,600, which applies to her application. Specified limited company income. We discussed the specified limited company definition earlier on in this video. Again, if you're still not sure whether the sponsor's employing company is a specified limited company or not, you may wish to watch part 2 of our 3-part Common Mistakes YouTube video series, which discusses this in great detail. And we also have a comprehensive article on our website, migrate.org.uk. Most commonly, specified limited company income is included under category F. It can also be included under category G, but since category G involves a lot more paperwork, in 99% of instances, partners can completely disregard category G. To calculate the amount of specified limited company income that you can include towards a financial requirement, you must first identify the specified limited company's most recent full financial year that passed. The company's financial year can be found by looking at the CT600 company tax return document. Here is a CT600 company tax return document example. Zooming in, we can see that in this example here, the financial year starts on the 1st of April and ends on the 31st of March. So using this financial year, if an application is submitted on the 30th of March 2023, i.e. a day before the financial year ends, the relevant financial year will start on 1st of April 2021 and end on 31st of March 2022. On the other hand, if an application is submitted one day after the financial year ends, on the 1st of April 2023, the relevant financial year will start on the 1st of April 2022 and end on the 31st of March 2023. Because of this, it is quite commonly the case that accounts for the company need to be filed much earlier than they normally would to comply with the standard UK tax rules. The second step involves totaling the sponsor's gross employment income that was received in that financial year, as well as totaling the dividends received and declared during or in respect of that financial year. The total of these two will be the amount of income that can be included under category F if everything is evidenced correctly. Earlier on, I mentioned that the specified limited company income can also be included under category G. The difference between category F and category G is that while category F is based on the company's most recent full financial year, category G is based on the company's two most recent full financial years. So you would simply provide documentation relating to 2 financial years as opposed to 1, as well as calculate the mean average of the employment and dividend income figures. Non-employment income. Category C comprises of numerous types of income, a list of which you can see here. Unlike employment and specified limited company income, which we previously discussed, both the applicant and sponsor can include this towards the financial requirement. So for example, if the applicant earns property rental income from an overseas property, as long as that property rental income is evidenced correctly and the property rental income requirements are met, that income can be included towards the financial requirement. Other than maintenance grants and stipends, the general rules for these different types of income is to include the gross amount received in the 12 months before submitting the application. Let's now discuss relying on cash savings for UK Fiance visa applications, which is included under category D. As is the case with all partner visa applications, the cash savings here can be either cash savings of the sponsor and or applicant. If, as is more commonly the case, the minimum income threshold is £18,600, you will need more than £18,600 in cash savings. This is because there is a particular formula that you must follow to convert the cash savings into an equivalent gross annual income figure. Step 1. Identify the lowest amount of cash savings held or will be held at one point in time in the 6 months before submitting the application. If you're relying on cash savings held in only one bank account, simply identify the lowest figure as seen in the statements. If, however, you're relying on cash savings held over numerous accounts, if it is not clear after a quick look at the statements that the total amount held is above the required amount, we would sometimes recommend creating an Excel sheet, which will help the Home Office caseworker, as well as yourselves, identify what this figure is. Most banks allow the statements to be exported into Excel format, which will save you a ton of time creating the Excel spreadsheet manually. And if the cash savings are not held in British pounds, the cash savings will need to be converted using the conversion calculator found on www.oanda.com, based on the conversion rate on the date that you submit the online application by paying the Home Office fees. Step 2 will require you to minus the figure in Step 1 by £16,000. In Step 3, the final step, will require you to divide this number by 2.5. Once you've done this, the result will be the cash savings gross annual income equivalent figure that can be included in the financial requirement. Just to give you an idea of the amount of cash savings required, here is a table which shows the required amount of cash savings required. Here you can see that if no dependent children are applying, £62,500 cash savings is required to have been held for 6 months, while £72,000 cash savings will be required if there's one dependent child who is also applying as part of the fiancé visa application. So, as with most areas of the immigration rules, there are numerous caveats to what we have discussed. For example, if some or all of the cash savings are a result of selling stocks, shares or property, the calculation, as well as the amount of time in which the cash savings needs to have been held, changes. For more information about cash savings, we have written a comprehensive guide on our website, migrate.org.uk. We may also create a YouTube video specifically discussing this, so feel free to subscribe to be notified when we do so. So, we've discussed categories A, B, C, D and F. Let's now discuss pension income, which is included under category E. The first thing to note is that both the sponsor and the applicant can include pension income towards the financial requirement. The calculation of the amount of pension income that can be included towards the financial requirement is rather simple. It is the gross amount that is being received when you submit the application, if the pension income has been a source of income for at least 28 days before the submission of the application. It is not the total gross pension income received in the 12 months before submitting the application. I recently received an email from someone who purchased our DIY application pack service who was not sure what the difference was between the two. So I'll quickly explain this here. Here you can see that the person started to receive £1,000 a month in pension income 2 months before the submission of the application. Since when the online application will be submitted, the person will be receiving £1,000 a month in pension income, the amount of income that they can include towards the financial requirement from pension income will be £12,000, which is the relevant equivalent gross annual income figure. The relevant figure here will not be £3,000. We will now discuss the sponsor's self-employment income as a sole trader, partner, or franchise. Only those self-employed as a sole trader, partner, or franchise are considered to be self-employed in the immigration rules. If the sponsor owns a limited company and pays themselves a salary and/or dividends, that income will normally fall under the specified limited company category. It will not be considered to be self-employment income, since self-employment is only those who are self-employed as a sole trader, partner, or franchise. To calculate the amount of income that you can include towards the financial requirement, you must follow the following steps. Step 1. Identify the most recent financial year that passed. For sponsors who are self-employed in the UK, the most recent full financial year that passed will be the most recent 6th to 5th of April self-assessment tax return period. For example, if the application is submitted on the 4th of April 2023, just before the financial year ends, the relevant financial period will be the 6th of April 2021 to 5th of April 2022. On the other hand, if you apply on the 6th of April 2023, just after the financial year ends, the relevant financial period will be the 6th of April 2022 to the 5th of April 2023. 2 points are worth making here. Firstly, the UK tax rules require the self-employed person to submit the accounts much later than what the immigration rules do. Therefore, if you apply shortly after the 5th of April of any given year, even though HMRC will not require you to submit the self-assessment tax return, the immigration rules unfortunately do. Secondly, for self-employed persons outside the UK, in other words, their tax resident overseas, the relevant financial year will change depending on the taxation system in the country in which they're deemed to be self-employed. Furthermore, sponsors who are self-employed overseas when the application is submitted will also be required to show that either 1. Their self-employment is ongoing and will be continuing in the UK, or 2. They have a job offer of salaried or non-salaried employment in the UK starting within 3 months of their return. The second step will be to identify the gross taxable profits from the sponsor's share of the business in the relevant financial period, not including any deductible allowances, expenses, or liabilities which may be applied to the gross taxable profits to establish the final tax liability. Now, this figure, which will be the amount includable under category F, is not something that's always immediately clear, largely due to the Home Office's definition of gross taxable profits, which does not include deductible allowances, expenses, or liabilities. So the best person to ask regarding what this figure is will be the sponsor's accountant. Self-employment income can also be included under category G. However, it's quite rare for partners to rely on this category, since this will rely on the 2 most recent full financial periods, which unnecessarily complicates things for most. So in this video, we have discussed the sources of income that can be included in the financial requirement. Let's now discuss the sources of income that cannot be included in the financial requirement. 1. The starting point is that income from benefits cannot be included in the financial requirement for UK fiance visas. This is the case unless the sponsor receives one of the following benefits, whether they receive it on behalf of their child or not. As we've previously discussed, if the sponsor does receive one of these benefits, the adequate maintenance test applies, which will only require you to show that your weekly net income, minus housing expenses, is greater or equal to the amount of income support an equivalent British family of your size can receive. Importantly, the minimum income threshold of £18,600, higher if dependent children are applying, will not apply. We have written a rather comprehensive guide on the adequate maintenance tests on our website, migrate.org.uk, so if the sponsor does receive one of these benefits, you may decide to give that a read. 2. Credit card facilities and loans cannot be included towards the financial requirement. So the immigration rules makes it clear that you cannot borrow £62,500 from a lender and then rely on that as cash savings to satisfy the financial requirement. 3. In nearly all applications, third parties, in other words, people other than the applicant or sponsor, cannot sponsor the application just because the financial requirement is not met based on the permitted sources of income that we've already discussed. For example, a wealthy friend or family member cannot simply write a letter stating, "Please see my attached bank statement showing an income of £100,000 per year and cash savings of £2 million. I'm happy to sponsor the fiance visa application." As is normally the case in the immigration rules, there are exceptions to the rule that there cannot be third-party sponsorship, however. One commonly relied on way to satisfy the financial requirement is for a friend or family member to gift, but not loan, cash savings to the applicant and/or sponsor. For example, On the 1st of January 2023, the sponsor's father gifted the sponsor £62,500 by transferring it to the sponsor's bank account. On the 1st of July 2023, 6 months after the date that the cash savings were gifted, the sponsor submitted the application. Since the sponsor's personal bank statement showed that the sponsor has held the cash savings for 6 months, and that the cash savings did not fall below the required level of £62,500, the financial requirement will be met, if the application is evidenced accordingly. An exception to the rule that there cannot be third-party sponsorship will apply if there are exceptional circumstances which could render refusal of the application a breach of Article 8, because it could result in unjustifiably harsh consequences for the applicant, sponsor, or a relevant child. It must be stressed, however, that this is an incredibly high threshold, and it is most commonly the case that this very high threshold will not be met. So that was a discussion of what can and what cannot be included in the financial requirement, and how permitted sources of income are generally calculated when it comes to the financial requirement. The word generally is used because there are, unfortunately, many caveats that apply to the financial requirement. For example, when different sources of income are combined, the calculation can change. Where maternity, paternity, adoption, or sick pay is received, this can change the relevant period, as well as the calculation and required documentation. When income is received in cash, as opposed to a direct bank transfer, this can result in only the net amount of income being includable towards the financial requirement, not the gross amount as is standard. All sources of income cannot be combined. For example, self-employment income and cash savings cannot be combined. Cash savings does not always need to be held in cash for 6 months prior to submitting the application, if additional requirements are met. And whilst employment income under category A and B ordinarily requires the person to be employed when the application is submitted, there is no such requirement for sponsors who are based overseas when the application is submitted, as they do not necessarily need to be employed when the application is submitted. There are loads of points such as this which we discuss on our website, migrate.org.uk, and we can elaborate more on these in future YouTube videos if we see that people find these videos helpful. So feel free to like the video, let us know in the comments, or subscribe. The Fiance Visa Adequate Accommodation Requirement. The Fiance Visa Adequate Accommodation Requirement is slightly different to other spouse and partner visa applications. When it comes to non-fiance visa applications, you must submit documentation when you submit the application, which shows that adequate accommodation has already been arranged for the applicant for as soon as they arrive in the UK. However, for UK fiance visa applications, accommodation for the applicant on arrival to the UK may be prospective. It is technically only accommodation for when the marriage has taken place that you must show, when you submit the application, that this has already been arranged. With this being said, from a practical point of view, and to keep things simple, it is often the case that it would just be easier to ignore this distinction and show that there's already accommodation in place for the applicant on arrival in the UK. So what kind of UK accommodation does the Home Office expect to see documentation relating to? This accommodation must be accommodation which the family own or which they occupy exclusively. This does not require you or your partner to own accommodation in the UK already. Rather, partners most commonly either rely on accommodation in which the applicant and or sponsor own, accommodation in which the applicant and or sponsor rent, or a friend or family member's accommodation. Staying at a friend or family member's accommodation just to satisfy the adequate accommodation requirement is something that partners find rather convenient. There are often no additional fees incurred because of this. The friend or family member is normally happy to help you by providing the required documentation, and this would not normally require you to tie yourselves down to a minimum contract. The words occupy exclusively, which is used in the Home Office guidance, can initially be a bit misleading here, because you and your family unit do not need to be the only ones residing at the accommodation. Rather, accommodation can be shared with others if there's at least one part of the accommodation that is for the exclusive use of the family as sleeping accommodation. Another thing to note here is that the accommodation that you rely on must not be overcrowded. When determining whether the accommodation will be overcrowded or not, the main consideration is the number of rooms in the accommodation available as sleeping accommodation, not the number of bedrooms the accommodation currently has, and the listed number of people permitted to sleep in the accommodation without it being overcrowded. So, for example, if there are 5 rooms available as sleeping accommodation, up to 10 people can cohabit there without it being overcrowded. As mentioned earlier, the number of bedrooms the accommodation currently has is not relevant, but rather what is relevant is the number of rooms available as sleeping accommodation. And this is because the guidance only cares about how the accommodation could be organised, not how it is currently organised. Whilst an office or living room can be a room available as sleeping accommodation, kitchens and bathrooms cannot, and will therefore not count count as a room available as sleeping accommodation. Home Office caseworkers do not always treat everyone equally here. The gender of the persons is listed as being relevant in the Home Office guidance, as is the age, because children under a year old are not counted, whilst children aged between 1 and 10 are counted as half a person. Whether the persons in the accommodation are a couple is also relevant. The final fiance visa accommodation requirement is that the accommodation must not contravene public health regulations. But it will be exceptionally rare for this requirement to cause an issue. The Home Office will not send someone around the house to look for open wires or for fire hazards, and so this will really only be problematic if, in the supporting documentation that you provide, the Home Office caseworker has reason to believe that it's not sufficiently safe to stay at the accommodation. The fiance visa suitability requirement. In short, the suitability requirements list situations in which the application must be refused, situations in which applications will normally be refused, and situations in which the application may be refused. Let's now discuss the suitability requirements, which will mean that the fiance visa application must be refused. 1. The application will be refused if the applicant is subject to a deportation order. 2. The application will be refused if the Secretary of State has personally directed that the exclusion of the applicant from the UK is conducive to the public good. And 3. If the applicant left or was removed from the UK as a condition of a caution issued in accordance with Section 22 of the Criminal Justice Act 2003, less than 5 years prior to the date on which the application is decided, the application will be refused. Since these three are all quite serious, you really should know if any of these apply or not. For if the applicant, without reasonable excuse, has failed to comply with a requirement to attend an interview, provide physical data or information, the application will be refused. 5. If the applicant, without reasonable excuse, has failed to undergo a medical examination or provide a medical report where asked or required, the application will be refused. An example here is the tuberculosis requirement. And 6. The application will be refused if the applicant's conduct, character, associations or other reasons is such that the Home Office caseworker thinks that their presence in the UK is not conducive to the public good. So this is one of the suitability requirements which gives the Home Office caseworker discretion to refuse applications for various reasons. In some situations, it will be clear when a fiance visa application will be refused, such as when the applicant has been convicted of an offence for which they've been sentenced to a period of imprisonment of at least 4 years. But due to the discretionary nature of the suitability requirements, if you're concerned about this, you may want to consider discussing this with an experienced and qualified immigration advisor. Let's now discuss the situations in which the application will normally be refused. If the applicant has provided false information, representations or documents, or has failed to disclose material facts in relation to the application, either intentionally or unintentionally, the immigration rules state that the application will normally be refused. Whilst we would always advocate double and triple checking your application, simple typos such as misspelling an address is not something that would ordinarily cause refusals. Rather, it really depends on the circumstances. Secondly, the application will normally be refused if it is undesirable to grant entry clearance to the applicant for medical reasons. This is only relevant in very specific circumstances, usually when the applicant has specific infectious diseases such as Ebola. Thirdly, the fiance visa application will normally be refused if a maintenance and accommodation undertaking has been requested or required but has not been provided. One frequently asked question is whether the SU07 sponsorship undertaking form is required for fiance visa applications. This is not a document which is a general requirement for a fiance visa application. There are 3 more suitability provisions to discuss, so don't worry, we're nearly finished. The application will normally be refused if the Home Office decides that granting the fiance visa will not be for the public good because within the 12 months before the date on which the application is decided, the applicant has been convicted of or admitted an offence for which they've received a non-custodial sentence or other out-of-court disposal that is recorded on their criminal record. And the application will normally be refused if the Home Office decides that the granting of the fiance visa will not be for the public good because the applicant's offending has caused serious harm or the applicant is a persistent offender who shows a particular disregard for the law. On this point, you may be glad to hear that traffic and petty criminal offences are not something that would ordinarily cause issues. What can cause refusals, however, not only for the current fiance visa application, but also in future UK visa applications, is not declaring such offences when asked for in the online application form. And then finally, the applicant may be refused if the applicant has failed to pay litigation costs awarded to the Home Office, or if they've failed to pay NHS charges amounting to at least £500. Regarding litigation costs, you really should be aware whether there are any outstanding or not. And in the case of NHS charges, if you're unsure about this, the best people to ask will be the relevant hospital or clinic in the UK. So I've said the word refused quite a lot of times, which understandably can be quite anxiety inducing. inducing. What you will be glad to know, however, is that it's quite uncommon for the suitability requirement to cause refusals. Rather, it's most commonly the financial requirement. So please ensure that you're particularly familiar with the immigration rules as they apply to the financial requirement if you choose to prepare and submit the application yourselves. Again, if any of the points that we've raised has caused some concern due to the applicant's particular circumstances, you may want to speak to a regulated immigration advisor about this. The suitability requirements are among the many mandatory requirements that you must meet when you apply for a UK Fiance visa. If you found this video helpful and would like to see more of its kind, you're more than welcome to like the video and subscribe. We also have more than 40 free articles and guides about UK Fiance visas and partner visas on our website, migrate.org.uk, so feel free to check that out. Let us know in the comments below what you want us to cover in the future. We will do our best to accommodate as many requests as possible. I hope you found this video helpful.